they would advise the Native women that we'll do a tubal ligation and it's completely reversible, and it's not usually. So there are some things about the Indian Health Service provision that really did put Native Americans at odds with it. In some of the earlier days when things like tuberculosis were running rampant, people were sent to tuberculosis centers and they just didn't return. So there's a great mistrust of health providers that has lived to this day. And unfortunately, some of the recent things, some of the actual providers themselves have been found guilty of sexual abuse for their patients. Education about health systems and remedies. Indian Health Service is now pushing out information about prevention. That's something that we really can't provide under the underfunded health system, but some of the education flow is being improved. Lack of adequate housing. This is particularly true in the COVID situation, where isolation is extremely difficult. That's some of the advice that comes out of the CDC. Said, well, if you get it, then you go in your own bedroom and you use your own toilet and isolate the rest of the families, and that's just not possible in many Indian housing situations where you have multi-generational families all congregating in the same household. And then access to healthcare resources. Next slide. One of the things that I talk about when I give these presentations that these social determinants of health have been engaged and supported and informed by systemic racism that's been going on for, my figure is 500 years. And a lot of them are systemic. And if I've listed a few of the systems of oppression that have been really going on that have affected the Native American communities to a great degree, and some of them we've heard of them. Like treaty provisions denied. We've all heard about the broken treaties that the United States have taken against Native tribes. Many of the statutes and the policies and regulations remove the dignity of self-rule. Economic development on reservations is either lacking or wrong. There's been rampant discrimination in wealth creation, particularly lending and distribution of wealth. It's akin to like in the Black communities, urban Black communities, you have a concept called redlining. And what the financiers and the bankers did in the Black communities is they draw red lines around the communities of color, and they wouldn't lend in those communities. Well, something similar has happened here on reservations, that bankers were reluctant to provide capital on reservations, so that just made the economic situation even worse. On land policies, they allotted all the Indian land, breaking it up into small sections that economically were not viable. On reservations, you usually have multiple judicial and detention systems at work. We have both a tribal, a county, a state, and a federal judicial system all at work at the same time. And one of the things I've been reading about lately is the education was geared to destroy culture and identity. And what I'm referring to are the boarding schools. And I saw one statistic, and I'm trying to look up where I saw that. And it said that 73% of the Indian children were sent to boarding schools. And I think that was an older figure, but I'm a boarding school survivor. Both my parents were in boarding schools in Michigan. So that's where they were taught to parent. That's where they learned a lot of their family skills. That's where they were separated and the parent-child bond was broken. So the boarding schools have really really impacted Native Americans to the degree that it still hasn't recovered. Even though we're resilient, this thing has probably done the most damage as far as creating these systems of oppression and perpetuating racism throughout Indian country to this day. Lack of local Native input in decision making and food insecurity are concepts that are still at work. Some of it has improved over time. The federal government has created laws that make it easier for Indian tribes to program or run their own federal programs at the reservation level. So there's been some improvement there. Next slide. So there's still existence of systemic racism today, and I listed some of them that currently are really there. We speak now of intergenerational historical trauma. We're teaching our folks here to do trauma-informed care, sort of changing the paradigm of what is wrong with this person to what has happened to this person. There's concepts and theories out there that epigenetics, that some of this disparity is due to long-term chronic stress that has affected native DNA, and it's passed on genetically. And then most recently, we're probably all aware of the recent civil unrest that's happening in the U.S. today with things like Black Lives Matter, Native protests against pipelines, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the 2020 national presidential election, the January 6th Capitol takeover, and most recently, Asian hate connected with COVID. Next slide. Is there a solution? I picked this sound bite up in some of my research, and it sort of says it simply, but there is a lot of truth to it, and it says the protests must lead to laws and institutional practices that destroy the infrastructure of oppression. And it's very easy to say, but very difficult to do. But we're going to try anyway. Next slide. I'd like to change to a little discussion of spiritual care on the individual basis. Sort of what happens, and sort of some advice, or at least my opinion on how to interact with Native Americans. Next slide. Some of the considerations that I remind our people about is that Natives have deeply held belief in customs that may dictate what care should be provided. And there's tremendous variations in these beliefs and customs, both between and within tribes. For your information, there's 574 federally recognized tribes and many more state-recognized tribal groups in the U.S. So there's an abundance of variety within the Native community. Next slide. Learning about Native culture is good, but beware of making assumptions. All Natives are not the same. And clinicians need to remember that each patient has unique preferences and should be prepared to modify their approach based on patient and family member input. Next slide. I found, and for my own self, that avoiding the victim narrative is important. Despite historical and current trauma, Natives have resilience and are still here. We are survivors. Native Americans are doctors, lawyers, artists, business leaders, and we need to focus on the positive accomplishments that highlight the strength of Natives and their communities. Next slide. This is something that I was talking with our providers and in some of the training that I give our nurses and doctors, but before the intervention, this should really be appropriate with any group that is different than your own, that you're going to provide healthcare services to. But before the patient, if you know you're going to be working with Native American patients, do some homework, do some pre-work. Partner with Native colleagues and ask about their recommendations and feedback. And when you do come to minister to the Native American patient, I've found and recommend that it's important to mentally reset between patients to help optimize the patient-provider experience. It's almost like the way I've heard it explained by some of my spiritual friends is that you almost reset your energy so that you get rid of your negative energy before you come into the Native Americans room. And speaking with this group, this is probably a group that has the skills and the tools to do that. You pray before you enter that room. Pray for their good healing, their wellness, for not only the patient, but also the family and the extended family. It's really important to take time to have high quality conversations, not rushing the conversations with the patient and their family. And then importantly, be mindful of your own implicit bias. I also do implicit bias training for our associates here at St. Vincent. And, you just don't know what you don't know. And many times these biases come from several different levels, and sometimes they're so ubiquitous, you don't even know that you're biased until somebody may point that out. And there's ways to examine your implicit bias and become more aware of where you are coming from when you start to interact with these new groups. Next page, next slide. We're asking to cultivate and maintain trust when you're interacting with the Native American patients. Assess where patients are, ask open-ended questions like, I am wondering if you could tell me about your health and what's been going on. If patient or family expresses concern, and some of these people will express concern and some of it will be contentious, but you still need to offer empathy, understanding sort of their earlier position and their relationship they've had with earlier health providers. And it's, I found that it's always good to ask permission to share what you know and warn patients about the nature of the discussion and that this is serious and it may be not really what they want to be told. Next slide. Explain your purpose. Particularly with some tribes where English is their second language, do they need an interpreter or a translator? Particularly if we're talking about medical information and medical procedures. Ask them, how do you want to receive information? How does your family make decisions? Because there may be a matriarchal grandmother within the family system there that makes a lot of the decisions that may even override a patient decision. So you have to have, I guess, a feeling or recognize that. When requested, consider traditional healers. Try to honor traditional practices like smudging, songs, tobacco ties. At St. Vincent, we try to honor some of the smudging where we can, where it's medically possible. We invite healers in. This is a sort of a tragic victim of COVID. The severe restrictions for COVID has really injured, I think, the Native American communities where they could not be with their loved ones in their end of life crises. So it's been a real dramatic impact for the Native groups here. Be mindful of your sphere of control. If patient requests cannot be done, still say how you can support the request in other ways, advocating for the patient. Next slide. And of course, some of this is captured in our care plans that we develop at the hospital level. Being expansive and trying to get the information to put into that plan, include appropriate family members and understand cultural preferences, and that the cultural preferences may be different for each patient. Listen carefully and dialogue to ask right questions to create the plan. An important thing that really does play out sometimes is confirm that services required for successful discharge are available, understanding that a lot of transportation resources and financial resources may not be available for the patient after discharge. And also, it's important to be aware of the end-of-life information as to care of body, preparation for burial practices, even though much of this will probably happen at the mortician level. But still, it would be good to talk to somebody discreetly if there's anything that needs to happen for the native family at end of life. Next slide. So, in conclusion, really just enable and ask patients to take the lead in the conversations and asking open-ended questions. Tribal affiliation may inform preferences, but don't make the assumptions. Start at the beginning with each patient. Discussion of serious illness with the individuals would be framed by an understanding of what and how patient needs to know about the illness, informed by respect, compassion, and collaboration. Next slide. This is a reference that I've taken some of this information out of this article, and there's the website, and that website and that article contains a lot of other different information and links to working with Native Americans in the healthcare setting. So it's sort of a good jumping off point. Next slide. Questions? And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, anybody have anything for Gordon? Questions? Follow up?
Gordon, I'm wondering if you could speak to the vaccine rollout in the Native communities in Montana.
Surprisingly, we were expecting hesitancy of the vaccination, and surprisingly, the Native American communities within Montana, and I think nationwide, are accepting. I've seen one figure with the initial vaccine rollout that 76% of the Native Americans were wanting the vaccine, and this is probably due to the dramatic impact COVID had on their communities, whereas the high mortality and morbidity rates and the after effects of COVID are so much higher in Native communities that they really are embracing the vaccination in an effort to, if you will, protect the elders. But that's what I'm seeing both personally and in some of the literature I'm reviewing.
Thank you.
Can I ask Gordon? Thank you very much. I know that there's diversity amongst different tribes and cultures, but I just was wondering about treatment of dead bodies, and if there are restrictions on like who can care for or how to care for Native American, like are there traditional practices that would influence care?
Probably not at the hospital level. Like I mentioned, probably a lot of these would probably take place at the morticians, but yeah, there's several things. Some of the local tribes here like to prepare the body themselves for burial, and that may include pashing or washing and preparing the hair. Sometimes they'll paint the body with certain symbols that represent something to the families. I'm not aware of a lot of specific tribal practices, but I'm aware that they do exist, and it's what I advise our folks is to just be mindful of them, and maybe sometimes we're all different. Maybe there are none, but other times other families may be more traditional than others and may have a certain ceremony that they like to be respected. It's real tragic on COVID because usually deaths are, if the word is, celebrated. by the large extended families. They're used to having very large funerals, very large receptions after the passing of a Native American, and that didn't happen during COVID. You know, they did respect those rules to protect their own, you know, the sort of the protect the elder thing.
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
I wonder, Gordon, from that, what Rabbi Francine just asked, if there's going to be a kind of a recovery time for Native families coming out of those restrictions, if they honored them, how is that going to look, do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure there would be. You know, a lot of times what happens is that on later celebrations or ceremonies, like a powwow, they'll have like a memorial. They'll honor someone who has passed, and I'm pretty sure that that's probably going to happen to a larger degree than it has in the past, because just of the number of folks that have passed due to COVID and the restrictions they had on the funerals and what they were able to do to prepare that person for burial.
Yeah. We had something happen here. I think you and I talked a little bit about this when we were preparing for this, is the idea that in our behavioral health, we had some younger Native Americans come in, and there was a problem when younger Natives would not look in the eye, and they were told, look in the eye, like it was disrespectful from a white perspective not to do that. And the input I got from them was, this is not our culture, it's not what we do. Are
Mhm.
there some things like that that we need to be aware of as chaplains trying to create a connection?
You know, and I think individually, it probably goes back to the individual, either the individual tribe or family. You know, because I know that would, you know, I've heard that too, that it's, excuse me, a helicopter's landing.
I can't hear it so much.
Yeah, I'm in the flight path for St. Vincent helicopter, and I have my window open. So sometimes it gets noisy in my office, but yeah, but you know, body posture and things like that are things that you probably have to pick up on individually. You know, you know, I say, well, I'm largely culturated and assimilated. You know, so my father, who's a member of the boarding school generation, you know, trained me to look people in the eye. You know, he was of that. He was of that. In fact, he went so far as to discourage my participation in Indian rituals and ceremonies and things like that. And he didn't do any of that. He spoke Chippewa, but he didn't teach any of his children to speak Chippewa, because his thinking was that it would get in the way of being accepted by the white community.
Yeah.
You know, and that's teaching, and that's learning that comes straight out of the boarding school. That was the mission.
Mhm.
Kill the Indian, save the man. You know, that was the vision, the mission for boarding schools, and it plays out even today. You know, so it affected how they parented their children in later generations, and probably most importantly, it broke the parental child bond. And that probably set up a whole host of adverse childhood experiences that are still playing out now.
Mm.
Gordon, I do a lot of chaplain work in terms of counseling on addictive behaviors. Are there some keys to beginning the conversation with Native Americans?
Well, I think an understanding of of their trauma, their earlier trauma, that they may be using the drugs or alcohol to mitigate. I think that has a lot to do with a lot of the alcoholism and drug abuse that I see happening within our Native communities in my own self. We have a recent take on Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called the Wellbriety Group. And what the Wellbriety program teaches is it teaches you to be holistically balanced. So, the drugs and alcohols are a symptom. They're a symptom of something deeper and underlying. And you pull in some of the traditional healing and the traditional procedures into the Wellbriety group, and it's usually mostly natives. So you have natives new in recovery coming in, and then you have natives that have been in recovery for several years, so that they can teach and mentor each other through this group participation, and that seems to work. That seems to get a toehold where maybe just a traditional 12-step treatment program, non-Indian, may not have worked. I've my second wife, I'm not bragging, but my second wife was an alcoholic, and she'd been through like 6 treatment facilities, treatment programs, and none of them worked. And she eventually died of her alcoholism at the age of 40. Mm-hmm. And for her, it never did work, and it just didn't keep a toehold, and she kept relapsing. But
I've seen many people of all cultures go through these programs, and they're wonderful, but they have to be consistently following up with outplacement services. And we're very fortunate here in Great Falls with many of those. So I recommend many, but you've given me some insight as to how I might begin the conversation. And I like the wellness concept. And one of your comments really struck me as you were doing your presentation, and that is not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. So
yes,
that's the key.
Yeah, trauma-informed care, it's changed a lot of that, and that really does make sense. Probably when you're working with any group.
Yes.
It just makes sense to be holistically minded to really heal the complete person.
Indeed.
Aaron, we ought to put that into our integration thing, huh?
It's just thinking that. Yeah.
It came up yesterday. Gordon, I have a question about around here we have natives who will rarely say that they are traditional practicers, but will often claim a, for lack of a better term, white religion. But when you talk to them, they practice both, or even just tradition. Could you address that? Like, what do we need to be aware of, and how does that work in the Native mindset?
Yeah, there's in my view, in my opinion, all natives are spiritual, and how they practice that spirituality, there can be a divide. Keeping in mind again that the original boarding schools were run by religious factions. And so part of the mission of the boarding school was to convert the savage to Christianity, and I'm a Methodist. My dad was a Methodist. And I always kind of wondered, why did my father choose to be a Methodist? And it dawned on me, I was doing some research for some of these talks, and they went to the Mount Pleasant Industrial School. That was the name of their boarding school in Michigan. And that school was run by the Methodists. So he just continued that thinking on with, well, I know something of the Methodist faith, so that's what I'll use for my family. And in other instances, it seems like most of the people I've married are Catholics. Like my current wife is Catholic, and my current wife is Native, and she's gone to boarding school. So I've called myself a tag-along Catholic because I'd usually go with her to the Catholic services, and short of participating fully, have been there in the pews alongside her. And I get great spiritual uplift from the message that I've heard at the sermons, and then I also attend the Wellbriety sessions that have a more of a traditional a flavor, if you will, to them. So maybe I walk in both worlds when I do that, and having been denied a lot of the traditional upbringing, it's like I have a thirst to get back to that. It's probably an identity thing, or maybe how I feel about myself. Because obviously, I can't pass for a white man. I'm brown skinned and obviously Native or Mexican or something else. So it has created a thirst in me, and I've been making an attempt to get back to that. And my young son has turned the deaf ear to my attempts to get him to embrace some of the Native culture. And he's purely an urban kid. He grew up in Billings, Montana, and in the school system here, public school system, and I used to call his group he was running with the Rainbow Crew, because he would run with kids, and they were Mexicans, they were Black, they were Indian and white, and he'd run with this group, and they were all tight together, and they'd stick up for each other and things like that. And it was almost like a gang affiliation, that they were getting support from each other in that regard. But he's had his issues with alcohol and drugs that he's struggling with.
Any other questions for Gordon?
Well, I sure want to thank you folks for your time and the honor to be here. I really enjoyed talking about these kinds of items, and hopefully I could illuminate some of the Native thinking that's going on out there, that can provide us all a basis to provide better health care to our Native population.
Thank you, Gordon. This has been enlightening. I really enjoyed it.